So the last speaker is Ed Parsons. He's the Google geospatial technologist and also a Google evangelist. And at the moment, he's also working on open data standards and will talk with us about is that the word in your pocket? So please, warm applause to Ed.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think my presentation is going to be a bit different, but it is going to bring together a lot of the other content that we've heard today. It's really going to cover two aspects of geospatial technology, very much focused on the mass market, on everybody outside this room wandering around Oxford, wandering around the world. What is the impact of this technology been on them? And there are two real themes I want to cover. One is about the accessibility of maps today and how much more accessible they have been than at any other point in our history. And that also draws into question what actually is a map, because I want to identify the point that actually a lot of the maps today that we use are actually images and focus on images. And then I'm going to basically do a little bit of storytelling to talk about how technology in the geospatial realm, but technology in general, accretes. How do we take one piece of technology and then on that build another piece of technology and on that build another technology? And do so using a combination of geography and history. Because obviously, as we all recognize, you can't really separate space and time. They're one and the same. Not when you get into Minkowski space and all of the physics, but reality is something happens somewhere at some point in time. And there are often really important connections. Okay, so let's start with an image we've seen multiple times already today. This is the famous Earthrise picture that was taken by the crew of Apollo 8, just going into lunar orbit, looking back at the planet Earth in 1968. It's something we're all really familiar with. We've seen this image multiple times today, but throughout our lives, we've probably seen this image multiple times, and we understand the impact that it has had on society. Many people argue that it was one of the primary drivers of the whole environmental movement, recognizing, that little blue marble in space on its own, in the vast darkness of space. That was our home. What's really interesting is that only 27 people have ever seen that with their own eyes. They were the crew of those Apollo missions that went beyond Earth orbit. The last people to see that image with their own eyes did so in 1972. So since 1972, no one has seen that little blue dot in space with their own eyes. The first 3 rows of this auditorium would be the number of people that have seen that with their own eyes. But yet, we all are very familiar with it because it's become accessible through technology. It's become accessible through imaging technology and ways of distributing those images around the world, both in mass market, TV, movies, obviously, but most importantly for this conversation, the tools that we use on our computers and increasingly in our mobile phones. So that blue marble, that little blue dot in space, now is on our desktop computer. Everyone's desktop computer has that. And then within the last 15 years, it's now on our mobile phones that we carry around in our pockets. And those mobile devices, once upon a time we called them phones, but in reality, how many people actually use them for phones? They're actually little mobile computers, incredibly powerful mobile computers with enormous processing power. But they're a gateway into vast volumes of geospatial content. And much of that geospatial content and much of the real value of that, I think, is driven not by traditional cartographic maps, but by real imagery, by imagery acquired from satellites, from aerial photography, terrestrial imagery, imagery that's uploaded by us as individuals. Increasingly, I think we see the world through images as opposed to cartography. And to prove how this works, I'm going to carry out a very dangerous experiment, particularly for this time of the day. I want you. Oh, let's just make sure my audience is representative. How many people in the audience are from Oxford? How many people are visiting Oxford for first, second time? You've been here before. Most people. Okay, good. You're representative for me then. Close your eyes, everyone. Okay, and in your mind's eye, think about the Radcliffe camera. Okay? Now open your eyes. How many people saw something that looked like that? How many people saw a map? We don't see maps. We don't see abstract representations of the world from above, shaded in different colors, black and white, pastel colors, whatever. We see the world as images. We see the world captured, in this case, using the same photogrammetric techniques we've heard from this morning, at capturing at a very different scale, the paper maps, the maps that we've seen. Here, we're using the same photogrammetric techniques. This is from the very latest technology that Google uses, flown from a light aircraft that flew over Oxford at some point, probably last summer, with a dedicated camera design that has 9 cameras pointing in different directions to give us the photogrammetric data that we need. It allows us to circle around that image in Google Earth or on Google Maps, zoom in, zoom out, see literally anywhere on the planet with a very, very similar level of detail. Where there are buildings, settlements like that, we will have that level of detail. Yes, in the middle of the deserts, in the jungles of South America, we won't have the same level of detail, but it will be enough to give you that sense of what that place is like. And what's really interesting about images like this is there is no design choices being made. You're seeing pretty much what you would see if you were there. There's no detail removed. The cartographic process of abstraction hasn't happened here. And we're actually quite good at interpreting images like this, even though most of us have not really had that experience of flying over the towns, villages of the UK or even anywhere else in the world. But yet that ability to interpret this information, and particularly as we all do, the first time probably we use Google Earth, you go to your home and you have a look around the neighborhood. You know, yeah, I recognize everything. That ability to interpret, you then can transfer to anywhere else on the planet and have that same level of trust and understanding of the imagery that you're looking at. Okay, but how do we do this? How have we built this capability to have high-resolution imagery of anywhere on the planet available to us in those devices that sit in our pockets? And what I want to do now is to use this technology, geospatial information, to take you on a journey, to take you on a story that involves 3 places that changed maps forever. Those 3 places are actually within a few miles of each other. This is Sunnyvale in California, so it's part of Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley itself, I don't know, anyone visited Silicon Valley? Few people. Those of you who have will know it's not the greatest neighborhood. I often describe it as a bit like Croydon with better weather. It's okay. But you can see from this imagery, it's not particularly dense, suburban sort of area. In the middle, you have Moffett Field. And what I've identified are 3 places that are important in this story: the Blue Cube, the Googleplex, and one Infinite Loop. Those of you who are a bit more geeky will understand some of the references, but I'm going to explain them as we go through this. Part of the reason that so much of technology has grown in Silicon Valley is largely accidental. Yes, Stanford University being there has been really important, but a lot of it is down to the fact that perhaps, Bill Stockley was born in Palo Alto. When he was kicked out of the Bell Labs, went home and set up the semiconductor industry there. That's just where he'd grown up. It was mostly apple and fruit farms before the technology industry came along. Okay, so let's go to our first location. The first location is the location of what's called the Blue Cube. And you look at that and say, well, okay, Ed, I don't see a blue cube, but that's because the blue cube's not there anymore. This is an image that was acquired about 18 months ago. The building you see in the middle of the screen is the Community College of Sunnyvale. It's been developed relatively recently. This whole industrial area, very close to Moffett Field, was once the location of Onizuka Air Force Base and the Lockheed Martin facility that built satellites and communication systems for satellites. And as part of the facility, once upon a time, in that location, there was a big building called the Blue Cube. And the Blue Cube was used by an agency that doesn't exist in the United States government, nevertheless, that operates Earth observation satellites for the National Reconnaissance Office, the Department of Defense, and so on. This was the location that the spy satellites known as Keyhole were operated from. This is KH-11, the Keenan Advanced Reconnaissance Satellite. To give you some sense of scale, if I'm standing up, I'm not a particularly tall guy. At the end, me standing up will be about the same height as the satellite. So, it's probably the size of two transit vans parked beside each other. It's quite a large satellite. It's very equivalent in size to the Space Telescope. And if you remember the Space Shuttle had a cargo bay. The size of the Space Shuttle cargo bay was designed specifically for this satellite. That's why it was the size that it was. It was the first electro-optical spy satellite. Before this satellite was launched, there were clearly spy satellites, and the way they operated was they go over the place that they were interested in. A traditional film camera would take pictures, much as traditional film cameras did. And at some point, when enough film had been gathered, a capsule would be dropped from the satellite with the film in it. It would enter the Earth atmosphere and be picked up by a C-130 Hercules, which would catch the capsule, and they would take the film to be developed not in Boots, but in a big secure facility in Washington, and they would then digitize the pictures. What the Kennan satellite introduced was the ability to image electronically, to capture an electronic image and radio that back to Earth. So you could get an image within minutes of it being acquired and sent around the world, sped up the whole process. And that's where the digital imaging that we use today in our mobile phones came from. The key element of the Kennan satellite was something called a charge coupled device, an electronic chip that recognizes light and turns that light into voltage. That's what's inside all of our smartphones, the digital cameras that we might have. So this gave us the ability to process electronic images. They were sent down to Earth to the defense and intelligence community that banged their heads against the wall because it was really hard to get hold of the images they wanted. Really, really difficult. A common story in data. Next location. This is the Googleplex, i.e. the main offices of Google in Mountain View. Well, it's now the Googleplex, but in our story, when our story starts, it was the offices of a company called Silicon Graphics, SGI. Silicon Graphics were one of the forerunners of sophisticated computer graphics. If you think about the early Star Trek movies, where they were starting to have computer graphics, starting to have CGI, they were all created by Silicon Graphics computers. Silicon Graphics computers were huge. This is a reality engine computer. It would cost you the price of a house. and would, take a huge amount of energy to operate. You needed to be real computer scientists to operate these things. But they were developed by SGI in that building in Mountain View. It was a dodgy business model. People could see PCs and small computers and workstations coming along, recognizing the fact that, hey, people are not going to be buying all of these big, expensive computers forever. We need to get out of this business. So 3 engineers from SGI, John Hankey, Brian McClendon, Michael Jones, left, and they created a company called Keyhole, after the satellite. Bit of an in-joke in the neighborhood, but also in the community. What they took with them was some technology in terms of computer processing that would allow you to display lots of images really, really quickly, and to focus on the parts of the images that changed. And what was their initial demo idea of doing this? Well, it was that famous Ray Ames idea of Powers of 10, this movie that was created that you went by a factor of 10 up in space or a factor of 10 down to a microbe. And each individual image was 10 times the size of the other. And they thought, hey, if we can produce a computer system that will be able to do that scale change in real time, that will be really cool. And what they came up with was something called the Keyhole Earth Viewer in 2001. And this took as much satellite imagery as they could buy to allow you to do that zoom in and out in a few areas of the world. It was actually distributed on a CD. Remember those? And you'd install the software in your computer. It would have an online connection to a database that was running in an office in Mountain View. Like any startup, they struggled. They struggled for a good few years trying to get this concept to work. The key point here is it wasn't free. Of course it wasn't free. You had to pay for the software. You had to pay an ongoing license to access the data as time went on. Depending on who you talk to, Keyhole were within days of going bust. Really, edge of the seat stuff. People mortgaging their houses, selling whatever they could sell to keep the payroll going when the Iraqi war happened. And one of the customers for Earth Viewer was CNN. And CNN not having any content in real time of what was going on in the war, 24-hour news, let's put Earth Viewer on and have people zooming in and out of Baghdad and finding out what's going on. That took off, and overnight, the company was saved. A year later, the company was bought by Google, who had taken over SGI, removed them from their offices. They are now Google offices. But the important part of this story is not that there was a great technology leap here. There was, clearly, the technology changes that allowed clip mapping, that allowed this very rapid movement between different images, that allow you to fly around the Earth in near real time. Yes, that was a great technological achievement. But what made the difference was Google acquiring the Earth Viewer, turning it into Google Earth, and basically writing a blank check to say, all of the satellite imagery that you need for the whole planet, we will go and buy it. Innovation was not in technology. The innovation was in terms of a business model. Google had an advertising-based business model. They could see that by making all of this Earth imagery available, they would get more people adding more content on the internet, more geospatial content on the internet. That was a different business model, one that hadn't really been thought of before from a geospatial data point of view. Because before that, all geospatial data was really, really expensive, hard to license. It's always really hard to get the data you needed. That was a big shift. Okay, my last location. You'll probably have heard of this. If you've ever bought an Apple computer, you might well have seen, well, a few years ago before the new spaceship campus up in the top corner there has been built. This was the original Apple offices at One Infinite Loop, Cupertino. And here, you'll remember the god of technology, Steve Jobs, came back to Apple after his exile, reinvented the company, started focusing on much more consumer-oriented products. And the most important product he worked on, you will think is, I know what you're going to say, was the iPod. The iPod was really important in that it took a technology and put it in your pocket. It put music data, digital data, in your pocket and made that data more accessible. Yes, I'm going to talk about the iPhone, of course, but actually it was the iPod that was the big shift in thinking. So I can take content, digitize it, and make it something I can carry around with me. You no longer had to have shelves and shelves and shelves of your LPs, your CDs, whatever. You put it all on your iPod, you can take your iPod with you. And actually the iPhone was a development of the iPod. That's what it was seen. We can add telephone functionality to an iPod and computing functionality to your phone. That gives you your iPhone. This was that big shift in thinking. It is an accretion of technology. All of these technologies are building on each other. So yes, let's talk about the iPhone launch. At the iPhone launch, Google Maps was there. There is an image of the Eiffel Tower. We can fly around the world. We can go anywhere. This demo was complete smoke and mirrors. You know, if Steve didn't do this thing after this thing, it wouldn't work. It was almost like a PowerPoint presentation. Had to be very, very careful about what features he demonstrated because a lot of the functionality hadn't been built yet. But one of the things that did work was the Maps application. So he could zoom in and fly around wherever and introduce the concept. Now, the real power of the Maps application is it was something that provided an interface to other types of information itself. Traditionally, maps have been rather a passive thing. You look at a map, you know the map was created at a particular point in time, and you interpret it. With maps on your mobile device, it's something that you interact with. You change the scale by pulling apart your fingers. You naturally see the rendering of the map change as you zoom in and zoom out. New features are produced. Today, if you log in, Google Maps is showing you a map that's unique to you because you've logged in and Google Maps knows about things you've searched for in the past. It knows your preferences in terms of how you want to travel. It's a unique feature. But what wasn't in Google Maps when it was launched back in 2007 was the ability for the application to know where you were. You had to say, I want a map of Paris, or I want a map of the Moscone Center in San Francisco where the demo was done, because the phone didn't know where you were. The phone didn't have what we now recognize as that key element, that little blue flashing dot. It had no idea of your location, didn't have GPS, didn't have any other technology to give you that location. It took another 2 iterations of the iPhone for that to come. Nokia had GPS in their phones at a similar time, but Nokia struggled, as everybody did at that point in time, and they still do today, if we're honest, with power consumption. The signal strength from GPS satellites is really, really weak. You need a very powerful receiver in your phone to pick up a location signal. If you have it switched on all the time, it will drain your phone's battery very quickly. Modern phones are very good at battery management, making sure they're not using GPS when they don't have to. Nevertheless, actually, this has probably been the biggest change. The biggest change in how we think about maps and what maps are to us as society. This is the ultimate in interactivity from a maps point of view, because the map is now centered on you. You are the center of the map, not Jerusalem, not London, not Paris. You are the center of the map, and you always will be the center of the map. Today, that blue dot comes from a multitude of different technologies. We talk about, it's GPS. 70% of the time, it's not using GPS because GPS will be a drain on the battery. And when I say GPS, there's actually 4 different constellations of satellites that provide your location. And most modern phones use all 4 of those constellations. But the vast majority of the time, it's using ambiently other signals, other RF signals that are around the room, Wi-Fi, cell towers, Bluetooth. All of those other sources of location information consume much less power and they're used much more often. It's only probably when you're asking directly for turn-by-turn directions that GPS is actually being used. Now, I said this has been the biggest change. This has been the most fundamental difference in how we use maps. And the reason why I say that is this: we are never now lost. When was the last time you felt lost? You didn't know where you were. It's actually a really scary thought. It's horrible when you're lost. We're not lost now because we have these devices in our pockets and we have that little blue dot all the time. Now, I'm going to finish now with, it's not a controversial point as far as I'm concerned, just because you've got that blue dot that will always tell you where you are, doesn't mean you shouldn't be lost. Actually, it's your backup. It's the ultimate, hey, I can get lost whenever I want. I know I can pull my phone out and I'll always be able to find my way to where I ever need to get to. This is a license to explore. This is a license to go and get lost. This is a license to go to places perhaps you wouldn't. There's a tyranny in always knowing where you are that comes with this technology. It's not just that blue dot in abstract, it's that blue dot in relation to everything else that's around you. Of course, I wouldn't suggest you don't use it, but use it with moderation. Use it perhaps when you need to use it, and when you don't need to use it, don't use it. Explore. As I said at the beginning, maps have never been more accessible. Images of our planet have never been more accessible. We can find out what the beach looks like at any hotel, anywhere we might want to go and visit. We can get images that have been acquired probably, at least within the last 6 months of most places that we might want to visit. They'll be up to date. They will represent the world as it is. That's a fantastic resource. Of course, we should use it. But we can also put that in our pockets. Say, well, actually, I quite fancy just exploring and seeing what I find, and always having that backup. Thank you very much.